Any sport which involves going up in the air has, of course, an element of risk. However, for most people, hot air ballooning wouldn't be at the top of your brown trouser list for danger and pumping adrenaline. The pace is slow, it's almost pastoral, and you're floating, you're not flying. There are no engines to fail and no runways to overshoot. But as we all know, this illusion of safety only holds until something goes wrong. For hot air ballooning, the obvious risks are drifting into power lines, sudden changes in the weather, or uncontrolled landings. These are the most common dangers. And yet in this case, none of those played a part. There was no bad weather, there was no mechanical failure, and there were no power lines. And yet, tragedy struck just the same. The 13th of August 1989 was a perfect morning for a balloon ride. Still, crisp air, the desert sun was just rising, and 5 balloons were drifting up from the scrubland southeast of Alice Springs in the outback of Australia. Dawn balloon flights were routine out here. Several small charter operators offered tourists a slow-motion panorama of the outback as the sun rose over the desert. Tourists often described the experience as magical. The balloons took off at dawn from Santa Teresa Mission Road in an area of bush that was under the Alice Springs control zone, with air traffic clearance of up to 4,000 feet. The various balloons were coordinated informally through visual lookouts and by using UHF radios, which all balloons were required to carry. 2 of the balloons that morning were operated by the same company, Toddy's Ballooning. VHWMS was piloted by Michael Samby. It launched first and climbed steadily up to around 3,000 feet, drifting westwards, with the intention to climb to the 4,000-foot ceiling as the sun rose higher. The second balloon, VHNMS, piloted by 24-year-old Anthony Fraser, took off shortly afterwards and was climbing steadily to follow. Both balloons were inside the Alice Springs control zone with approved clearance to fly up to 4,000 feet. Apart from the balloons, the sky was empty. The weather was calm and still. There were no obstacles, no crosswinds, and no signs of trouble. Both pilots had their UHF radios tuned to the same frequency, and both were aware of each other's presence. So, what could possibly go wrong? In the upper balloon, pilot Michael Samby was giving the tourists his usual talk about the outback, the animals that lived there, the flora and the geology of the landscape. He'd stopped ascending and the balloon was drifting serenely at an altitude of around 3,300 feet. Michael was talking his talk, the tourists in the balloon were listening, and the brilliant red sun lit up the landscape far below with long shadows. It was indeed a magical moment. And then suddenly, without any warning at all, they were engulfed in orange and black fabric as the crown of the second balloon rose up from directly underneath them. At approximately 6:38 a.m, the top of the second balloon, VHNMS, made contact with the basket of the one above. To those in the upper balloon, it would have seemed to appear out of nowhere, and in an instant their wicker basket was being engulfed in fabric, tearing against the taut, heated surface as the lower balloon continued to climb upwards. There was barely any time to react, and then came the sound that nobody wanted to hear, a sudden ripping as the corner of the basket tore into the envelope below. It was bad luck. The envelope tore just below the Velcro rip panel on the lower balloon. Now this panel is normally opened after landing to allow the rapid deflation of the balloon by letting all the hot air escape. In this case, the upper basket also fouled the control lines for the rip panel and the parachute vent, and it tore them open as the balloons pulled apart. In seconds, all the hot air was venting uncontrollably and it began to collapse. Passenger Jeff Smithers remembers the moment. We didn't see it coming. Suddenly, it was just there. There was the ripping as the top of the balloon below us tore apart, and then you could hear a rush of air. It was very scary, frightening. Its top was torn to shreds. Now in the lower balloon, pilot Anthony Fraser cranked the burners to full, but this was just no use. The rip was too big, and the balloon simply folded up in on itself like a giant streamer. Anthony Fraser and his 12 passengers began plummeting to Earth, the giant wicker basket spinning uncontrollably, the deflated balloon above flapping and twisting as they fell. They took 51 seconds to reach the ground, long enough for them to realise exactly what was happening. With the drag of the basket and the deflated balloon, it's unlikely that they reached terminal velocity, and that long, slow fall must have felt like an eternity. Many of the doomed passengers linked arms together, whether for a moment of mutual comfort or to try and survive the impact, we'll never know. Ken Watts, operating a balloon nearby, saw the whole thing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing when the balloon just completely deflated and plummeted straight down to Earth. I followed it visually down to the ground until the load struck the Earth. It was a sickening sight. It seemed to take forever. The balloon and basket had fallen almost 3,300 feet and the impact was absolutely catastrophic. Nobody survived. One person was thrown from the basket and the others were pinned in so tightly that it apparently took over 3 hours for paramedics to extract them all from the shattered wicker frame. Gas cylinders, struts, clothing and personal effects were scattered across the red dirt of the outback. Rod Kramer, one of the first responders, arrived to a scene of devastation. He remembers 2 ashen-faced policemen walking away from the impact site. He saw for himself the terrible scene. 10 of the victims were still linked by their arms. He described a silence that hung over the wreckage, interrupted by only the faint hiss of gas and then the arrival of the rescue crews. He rarely talks about what he saw that morning, adding only that he reckons that many people wouldn't be able to handle me telling them what I actually saw. For the small community of Alice Springs, it was a huge shock. At the time, this was the deadliest hot air balloon accident on record. The Alice Springs police set up a press conference and Superintendent Lindsay McDowell handed out a list of the dead tourists. Toddy's Ballooning issued no formal statement as Michael Sandby, the owner and pilot of the upper balloon, was reportedly in shock. The Civil Aviation Authority immediately suspended the company's operations, but Toddy's had already grounded itself voluntarily. The investigation uncovered a string of what you'd call procedural failures. Anthony Fraser, the pilot of the lower balloon, had ascended without communicating his vertical movement. Michael Sandby, pilot of the upper balloon, had left his burner idle for an extended period whilst he was giving his commentary to the passengers, which may have caused a slight descent or loss of altitude control. But he did not communicate any of this by radio, despite both Toddy's balloons being on the same radio frequency. In fact, throughout the entire incident, neither man made any attempt to coordinate their flight paths. Fraser had also failed to maintain a lookout for at least 30 seconds, during which time the upper balloon drifted into a dangerous position above him. From Sandby's position, Fraser had ridden into the blind spot directly beneath the basket, a zone which was invisible to both pilots due to the structure of the balloons. Sandby's balloon also lacked the standard instrument package required by company guidelines. Instead, he was relying on just a wrist altimeter, and that was not considered a precise enough tool for formation flying. The combination of visual limitations, passive drift, and poor communication created the perfect conditions for this collision, despite the total absence of any external risk factors. This was pure pilot error. In the end, Michael Sandby was charged with 13 counts of manslaughter, although this was downgraded to a single conviction under a dangerous act provision, as the law at the time was vague in how to prosecute anything to do with a hot air balloon accident. There were no black boxes, there were no radar tracks, there was no clear-cut evidence of recklessness. It was just a series of poor choices and oversights that were made on the day. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but that was later overturned on appeal. In the days that followed, ballooning companies resumed operations. Tourists in Alice Springs kept flying those balloons at dawn, but the regulations were changing and operators were now required to carry full instrument sets. Collision avoidance procedures were also rewritten. Airspace coordination became much stricter, especially in the shared control zones. At the time, the death toll of 13 people made this balloon tragedy the deadliest on record. And although this death toll has been twice surpassed in recent years in other countries, to this day, the 1989 Alice Springs tragedy remains Australia's worst ever ballooning accident.